So good morning, good afternoon and good evening. My name is Rich Clark and I am a hypnotherapist for the last 8 years and I've been a holistic therapist for the last 14 years. So for Truthful Tuesday and also for other posts during the week, I'm going to be talking about a few issues, and the first one I'm going to talk about is discrimination. So I'm going to split these up into different types of discrimination, but the first one I'm going to start with, which I think is probably the most important because it also, like a domino effect, goes into the other ones, is class discrimination. So, as we call classism. So class discrimination, also known as classism, is a prejudice or discrimination on the basis of social class. It includes individual attitudes, behaviours, systems of policies and practices that are set up to benefit the upper class at the expense of the lower class. Social classes refer to the grouping of individuals in a hierarchy based on wealth, income, education, occupation and social network. Studies have also showed there's an interconnection between class discrimination and racism and sexism. So class structures existed in a simplified form in pre-agricultural societies, but it's evolved into a more complex and established structure following the establishment of permanent agricultural-based civilizations with a food surplus. Classism started to be practiced around the 18th century. Segregation to classes was accomplished through observational traits. Now, what we have to remember is, with its 18th century, is we've got to think about what was created around there literature-wise, what was things, the education system, what was then, and so forth. So when we look at these intersections with other systems of oppression, social, economic, racial, ethnic, and gender inequalities in academic achievement have been widely reported in the United States, but also around the world. And these are also to determine academic and non-academic outcomes among school-aged children is not always well understood. So there's also institutional versus personal classism. So institutional can be within a society, within a company, within an office, within a company, within an educational institution, whereas personal can be actually people on the everyday life we deal with. So structural positions is also how we independently stratification of gender, race, class, religion, homosexualism, heterosexualism and age. So also LGBT would also be a form of class discrimination as well. And this is also in the context where gender is the primary privileged position, the patriarchy versus the matriarchy. Gender becomes the nodal point through which sexuality, race and class are experienced. So the media representation of class discrimination can be seen in many different forms as media such as television shows, films and social media. Classism is also systematic and the implications can go unnoticed in the media that is consumed by society. Right, so let's have a look at this. So we've also got to look into other things which goes into racism of the caste system, class conflict, elitism, Marxism, rankism, social inequality and so forth. So the other thing is what we have to do is we explain about the social class. So the social class is a hierarchy, and class is a subject which is mainly from sociologists, political scientists, anthropologists and social historians. It's also, some people argue that due to social mobility, class boundaries do not exist. However, they can, and I'm going to explain why. So, for example, they call the working class an emerging professional class. However, academics distinguish social class from social economic class. So the person who was always talking about class and the ideas was Karl Marx, defined class by one's relationship to the means of production, the relations of production. His understanding of classes in modern capitalist society is the proletarian work, but do not own the means of production, and the bourgeoisie, those who invest and live off the surplus generated by the proletarian's operation of the means of production, do not work at all. This contrasts with the view of the sociologist Max Weber, who contrasted class determined by economic position with social status. So, and when we're going to look at this in social class, we're going to look at some of the ancient ideas of this. So the existence of a class system dates back to the times of ancient Egypt. Right? It also is in the Sumerian class, it's in the Vedic culture as well, which is Vedic culture is as old as ancient Egypt, and then obviously the Romans and everybody else. But I'm going to explain it from the ancient Egyptian side. So ancient Egypt, where the position of elite was also characterised by literacy. The wealthy people were at the top in the social order, and common people and slaves being at the bottom, which is also considered part of the caste system, which is very prevalent in India to this day, though not as much because social mobility again. However, the class was not rigid. A person of humble origins could ascend to a higher point. Mostly this was men, because women were never given that position. So again, that's where the sexism part is also interesting, which will be the next topic I'll talk about. The ancient Egyptians viewed men and women, including people from all social classes, as essentially equal under the law, and even the lowest peasant was entitled to petition the vizier and his court for redress. Farmers made up the bulk of the population, but agricultural produce was owned directly by the state, temple or noble family that owned the land. So again, it's also about land ownership, which is what we see now. So if you own a property compared to someone who's renting a property, that's seen as a social class issue as well. So farmers were also subject to a labour tax and required to work on irrigation or construction projects in a corvée system. A corvée system is a force of unpaid forced labour that is intermittent in nature. And then statute labour is a corvée imposed by state for the purposes of public works. Slightly different. So artists and craftsmen are of a higher status than farmers, but they were also under state control. So most artists would write songs or they paint for the royalty, for the bourgeoisie, for the higher class. And this was seen in classical music in Europe. This was seen with all the kings and queens. The artists would also play for them, so that's how they'd get paid. It wasn't for the general populace, it was only for the wealthy. So this is where art and literature is seen as this. That's why this upper class idea of opera and so forth is all there. It's all prevalent in social classism. Now, there was also another thing as well, when not a single Egyptian was, in one sense of the word, free. So no Egyptian was free. No individual could call in a question a hierarchy of authority which culminated in a living God. This was a Durkheim's issue. So Durkheim is a sociologist, French sociologist, who talked about fundamentalism. So the idea of Egyptians being free was not true. The hierarchy was, but nobody else was. So when people talk about ancient Egyptians saying how great they were, there was actually not much freedom in that culture because everybody had to work towards a hierarchy and they didn't own anything. So elsewhere, and to say that this was something else as well, elsewhere, the ancient Greece, when the clan system was declining, the classes replaced the clan society when it became too small to sustain the needs of the increasing population. The division of labour is also essential for the growth of classes. So again, in Egyptian times, this is very common. Then this happened in Europe. Then also, Rousseau also had a large influence over political ideas of the French Revolution, because again, the French Revolution had the hierarchy of the people who could eat and do what they want, or like Marie Antoinette said, they can eat cake, the peasants, because they didn't even have enough money to eat bread. So there's always been this clash of class, and this is also goes into in Africa as well, in India, in China and all sorts. So again, the idea of this always occurred. And this indigenous people maintain social classes today. So India definitely does. Nepal, North Korea, Sri Lanka is an example, and there's more. Then also during colonialism, social relations were dismantled by force, which gave rise to societies based on the social categories of wage labour, property, private property and capital. But then also because of the use of education and also the academic side of The Origin of Races by Charles Darwin, the idea of the colonisers was seen as a hierarchy, even hierarchy than the kings and queens of Africa, of Asia, of South America. Completely absurd, really, but that is what they did. So now the class society or class-based society is an organising principle society in which ownership of property, means of production and wealth, is a determining factor of the distribution of power. And the effect on the population is societies with large class differences have a greater proportion of people who suffer from mental health issues such as anxiety and depression symptoms. And a series of scientific studies have demonstrated this relationship. So again, theoretical models about definitions of social class has been done. Then we go into the idea of social ideas of Marxism, again, which I talked about Karl Marx earlier with the idea of the bourgeoisie and the proletarian. So within this, we can also look about who we are and in the Western ideal. So we can go into Weberian and stuff, but again, and then there's also the great British class studies, and there was a lot of classism within the UK, which was an empire, if you do remember. So where is the issue here? So first of all, myself, my father was illiterate and he left school with no qualifications. My mother left school with no qualifications but is literate within a realm. She's not good at spelling, her maths is pretty poor as well. So socially, literacy wise, my parents are of working class origins. Now, me being born my parents rented a property. So again, working class, renting, having to work, paying someone for the property they lived in. Now, growing up, I saw that because of my parents were always trying to make ends meet, I always knew I never wanted to be that. I never wanted to be working class. So my knowledge of reading, and I was encouraged to read from a very young age. My grandfather would get me books. My grandfather and my grandmother were probably more middle class because they actually owned their own property. But they also stole money from a business they run with my parents. That's a long story, but that is something. So actually, technically, my parents would have been middle class, but they lost their money in a business, so they became working class. Now, within that, because I had a next door neighbour who also helped me read and also helped me with theology and so forth, I learned through reading, through literature and so forth to better the way I would talk, how I would conversate, how I'd express my feelings, how I'd express my thoughts. Also intellectually, I would watch a lot of programs, documentaries, so forth. So as a child, I always knew that education was my path out of being working class. So within classism, what you have is an issue is because you are coming from a working class background. All the people around you are generally working class. So what you have is a problem is once you are becoming educated, you are then outside of your class, you're defining yourself into another class because you're now becoming literacy and educated. Once you become educated, the working class people around you can sometimes have despite, they can be jealous because they think, well, you should be in the same social standing as we are. So then what they do is then we have this issue of what we call imposter syndrome. So we then get this idea of that myself, when you're educating, you're reading, then and you're getting educated, and then you end up going to do A levels, university, get a PGCE, get a master's, whatever these things are, you're getting more out of your station and what your social status is. So technically in the social status, my parents being working class, I should have been working class and doing a working class job, which would have been a mechanic or this is what I was seeing when I was growing up. Now this is not, I don't believe being a mechanic is a working class job. It's just that is what was seen. And we have to remember that at the same time, in England especially, if your father was a farmer, you would be a farmer. If your father was an accountant, you would be an accountant. It was like a continuing, and especially if you had the same name, because the reputation of the name, of your status, would give you credence within your work. That's what happened. So considering that my father was a mechanic and my mum was, could do late, she helped special needs children, but she wasn't really a teacher. Me going into what I did as education and learning and reading books and doing very well at school actually alienated not only my parents, but it also caused a lot of issues around me with my peers, because then all the other kids whose parents were working class or middle class, I was then coming out of that. So in fact what it does is in the education system, which is what Marx talks about, the bourgeoisie and proletarian, is that nobody who's a proletarian can ever become the bourgeoisie from an education point as working class, because as much as you get educated, you don't have the financial means to become middle class. So this is where things change. So for example, with myself, I'm actually going to be owning property. So I am considered middle class, I'm literate, I've got a degree, PGC, so I'm actually a trained teacher. And that changes the demographic of people I'm with. So the people I'm around, some of them have come from working class background and become middle class, or they are middle class already. So that also makes it very difficult, because you have this imposter syndrome that sometimes you don't understand things. So like some of my friends can speak multiple languages. I struggle with that because I was at school, I was never taught how to speak multiple languages. I was only taught German at school. You're not around the people who give you access to learn languages. I wasn't around people who could go and watch the opera. Now luckily I'd learned classical singing, so I got to manage to go to see operas because I actually had an opera singer teacher. So these are the things where you're always battling this with classism. And with classism, it becomes a very much an issue, especially with hypnotherapy, is when we're dealing with a lot of people, they really struggle to understand their identity. I never have. I know who I am. I'm very proud of what my parents did and how they brought me up. But at the same time, I know that if I bring my children up, they will not be working class, they will be middle class. And then I would have to but I would still bring them up with the working class values of working hard. I had to earn money. When I was a kid, I didn't have money given to me. I had to work for it. Everything. I had to have my room clean. I had to clean the car. I had to clean the house. So even if I went out on Saturday as a teenager, I still had to clean the house. The house had to be clean. Car had to be clean. My bedroom had to be clean. If my bedroom wasn't clean, my mum would actually bag up my stuff and put it out to the rubbish bin. I mean, I was disciplined quite a lot, and I knew that from that hard work ethic. And even as a kid, if I bought stuff from boot sales. So a lot of my clothes were from second-hand shops, not new. But then again, I used to also get records, and I learned how to trade records and buy them cheap and sell them on. So I learned how to do dealing and be a seller and a buyer. I learned all this stuff growing up. So actually, once I got to university and A-levels, I actually was already selling vintage clothing. I was selling records. So when I got to university, I was selling records, I was selling vintage clothing, and I was doing a working class job, working for whoever, plus doing my degree. So all the people I went to my degree, who I was doing my degree with, they all got given money by their parents, where I didn't, or they got their loan because they didn't have to worry about that, whereas I had to go and work, as well as still doing my degree. So I had to work 2 days a week to get my money, and then do my degree still. So the pressure on me was a lot harder. And I think this is something classism can be really complicated, but the factor is, this is my advice to anyone who wants to get out of their station of their class, is become educated and then learn how to make money. Learn how to make an income, whether that's self-employment, whatever that is. I mean, my grandfather used to always tell me, become self-employed. He was self-employed. He used to do stained glass windows. He was self-employed. He never really worked for people. And my parents, they always worked for people, and they said, going to do a job and so forth is a good status. But my grandfather was like the opposite. He knew that I had much more an entrepreneurial idea. And entrepreneurs usually are people who are middle class, but there is some working class people who somehow find a niche in the market and then become middle class or even upper class. And it does happen. And that's why a lot of working class people, when they become wealthy, actually still are humble and give back more than I think the middle class people do, in my opinion. So, anyway, to do with discrimination, classism is very important. I think it's also very relevant to your job you do, also your surname, your name. But then I'm going to go into the other issue, is when we go into the next category, which is sexism and racism, but they're going to be separate categories.